truth isn't something that in the world in which we live we try and run away from as being objective and make our own. Newman, and this was happening at the time when he was writing, we think of it as being a modern, very modern thing. Prophetically, he saw this at the beginning in the 19th century, he saw this. I've got to lean out and let my heart be touched by other people, and Newman was big on that. But Newman, it was hugely important to learn from other people because they're made in God's image just as he was. So Newman was looking always out to be influenced. He was somebody that influenced vast numbers of people, but he would have been the first to say, I have been influenced by vast numbers of people. And he'd been influenced because he was looking for Christ speaking through them to him.
Welcome to Into the Truth, the podcast from the Catholic Truth Society. My name is Piero Finaldi. I'm the CEO and publisher of the CTS and your host for this podcast. I'm very honoured and happy to be able to welcome Fr George Bowen to speak about something which is very exciting for every English Catholic, every Catholic in general, and I suppose for Oratorians in particular. So welcome, Fr George.
My pleasure to be with you.
Well, we are speaking about St. John Henry Newman, who is the newest doctor of the Church, which is a great honour for, I think, the Church in England in particular. We'll come back to that. But so, Father George, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and what's been your involvement in the whole kind of Newman story.
Well, for myself, I'm a priest of the Oratory in London, and I've worked really from a pastoral point of view as a school chaplain for most of my priestly life, and then more recently I help out in a hospital and at a prison. So I've got those are my pastoral experiences and what I focus on really. But with regard to Newman, it started for me personally when I was a kid, really, when I first heard the Dream of Gerontius. And I remember my grandfather said to me as a little kid, he said, you want to, you've got to listen to this bit of music. I was only about 8 or 9. And he sat me down and he made me listen to the dream, and he was shedding tears. And I think it was the first time I shed tears in music, listening to music. So that was my introduction. I went on later to study, coincidentally, under my tutor was at Bristol University, was an expert scholar, a Newman scholar, had written books on Newman. So I came across Newman then, particularly in the field of education, in his talking about education, in his theories about how universities and how education works. And then subsequently, of course, as an Oratorian, Newman brought the Oratory to England, and I grew closer to him and started to read more of his work and study him a bit, to some extent, very lightly. I'm no great Newman academic, not like a lot of other people in the world in which we live, but so I grew on. Then we had the canonization, or the beatification first, of course. Well, I was involved in that in a lightly, just helping out around the edges of organising one or two small things. And then the canonization, did a lot of the administration of the events surrounding the canonization. And then afterwards, actually it was straight after the canonization, lots of people were coming up to me and saying...
So that was October 2019, right?
Exactly. Lots of people coming up to me and saying, well, this is all great, but it's wonderful, but now somebody's got to start doing work on Newman is, of course, a shoo-in to be a doctor of the Church. And I was thinking, what? And after a bit, I realised, well, listen, somebody's got to, it was evident that could be that I should take this, that we should take this, we should take this seriously. And somebody had to start to prepare for that. And so at that stage, I sort of started to get involved, really, I suppose, of trying to drive forward the process of allowing the Pope and to give him the information which he would need.
Yeah, so tell us about that. Is there an application form for becoming a doctor of the Church? How does it work?
The first thing to say is it's entirely in the Pope's hands.
Right.
The Pope is totally free. I mean, it's not the information that is produced for the Pope is really background information, so to speak, and giving substance to him for him to be able to say in his freedom, look, listen, I would like to declare Newman anybody a doctor of the Church. The process really, what is a doctor of the Church? Well, I think the the way of thinking of this is what we mean by the word doctor. We think, when we say doctor, we think of running off to the GP, or a doctor of philosophy, somebody that's a genius, academic, a genius in one form or another. But actually, really, it comes from the Latin word to teach, docere, to teach. And a doctor of the church is somebody that is teaching us, the world, something that is timeless about our faith, and something that appeals across cultures in the world in the universal sense of the word. And of course, also something that's holy, so it's speaking from within the church in the Holy Spirit. So it's always reserved for people that are saints, already saints. You have to be a saint to be a doctor of the church. And then the process really begins with saying, well, listen, does anybody relate to Newman beyond the confines of his own nation?
Right. So that's the kind of universal aspect of things.
So that's the kind of universal aspect of the things. And that's the first bit that needed to be explored. And so initially it was really the best part of a year and a half. Of course, we had COVID in between, but a year, it's a good year really of working to try and encourage people to write in to the Holy Father, to write in to say, listen, we believe that John Henry Newman ought to be a doctor of the church. And the way that happened, it was through the Bishops' Conference of England and Wales, who were the actors, so to speak. They were the sort of the driving force.
And I mean, this is not a common thing. I mean, there are only 38 doctors of the church,
including John Henry Newman. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's two a century essentially.
I mean, that's from beginning. We're talking from St. Augustine, right the way through. Most recent, actually, really, is Teresa. In terms of time, is Teresa Lisieux, who was, and not somebody that you'd think of as being a great genius, but she had something timeless to say about the spiritual life, and so that's why she's the doctor of the church. So yeah,
I mean, as opposed to St. Teresa, I suppose, Newman's writings are pretty voluminous.
Voluminous is the word.
Yeah,
they're enormous.
Yeah,
he spent. I forget. I don't want to put a number on the pages of material that he wrote every day. Newman was a prolific writer. He wrote huge amounts. There's in the library at the Brompton Oratory. There's the desk which he used to stand at, probably many desks, but there's one that more like a pulpit really, that I remember well, where he used to stand and write away. A lot of what Newman wrote was in the form of responses of engaging people, almost in letter form. And his letters and diaries are enormously, they really are voluminous. So he wrote huge numbers of letters, and a lot of his most important work was really written in the form of an extended letter. Like an essay on the doctrine, there are lots of various different documents that have been produced, really essentially a sort of a lengthened version of what a sort of volume version of what would be a letter in that way. Yeah.
So to the non-specialist, to the Catholic in the pew, should we say, who's not a scholar, what is Newman? What are those really sort of universal and timeless things that Newman has said that are good for the church that all of us should know? Or
I would think that the way to begin that, would be, and I think he would quite like this, is to begin with the idea of education. Newman once said, "From first to last, education has been my line." In the large sense of the word education. And what did he mean? He didn't mean being a school teacher or being a tutor at university, which he was at Oxford. And he founded the Catholic University in Dublin. It wasn't and then he was later started schools, but it wasn't in that narrow sense. He meant education in the sense of what he meant by education. And I think the first thing that I'd say was important was Newman brings to us, to the forefront of our mind, an understanding that a centre of education, being educated, isn't just about developing the intellect. It's not just about developing our intellect in order for us to be able to be qualified to go and do a job. Newman was said, listen, it's about developing the character of the person. It's about bringing people, and he said education needs to be a moral. It needs to have it's an ethical, moral thing. He said at one stage, talking about a university, that a university should be having intellectual development as well as moral development under one roof. Under one roof, that intellectual and moral happens. So a university, a centre of education, was about developing what he would say, the holiness of somebody, that bringing out the character that is godly in them. And whether you see it in those terms, in terms of giving it a name, in an overtly Christian way, nevertheless, Newman would say that, however, and this I think would be he would want to say to any centre of education, it's all about, not just about developing the intellect. It's about developing the character. It's about developing somebody that is, in the true sense of the word, a civilized person, a civilized human being. And what do we mean by that? I think Newman was writing at a time when it was quite controversial, at a time in the British Empire when understandings of civilization were very much the kind of English gentleman who would slightly, a sort of slightly condescending attitude towards, and from a lofty height, there would be a slightly classical understanding of, I lean down from a lofty height to be generous and kind to those that are beneath me, kind of thing. Well, Newman was saying very much, get down there. That's what they teach in universities that don't have. We need to have a sense of we need to be living by a different understanding of what is this, what is it that makes us godly and holy, and for that's the way into an understanding of Newman, which I think is also hugely important, and that's Newman on truth. And let me explain, if you'd like me to. Newman was very keen for us to understand that truth isn't something that in the world in which we live we try and run away from as being objective and make our own. My truth is. My conscience says to me. My truth is. Newman, and this was happening at the time when he was writing. We think of it as being a modern, very modern thing, something.
But he saw the beginning of it.
He saw this prophetically. He saw this at the beginning in the 19th century. He saw this, and he said, "Look, listen." And he talked about that as being liberalism, but he didn't mean political liberalism. He meant, I am free to. I want to, in a sense, I want to be free from any truth that's not my own. And Newman said at one stage, it's not about being free from, it's about being free in the truth. His epitaph in Latin was ex umbris et imaginibus in veritatem, from the phantasms and shadows, from the images and phantasms into truth, towards truth, into truth.
Which is the name of this podcast, taken from that, of course.
There we go. Exactly. It's the name of your podcast. But this for him was his epitaph. He wanted that as his epitaph. That was his, as far as he was concerned, that's what the whole of his journey was about, is leaving behind the phantasms, and we're surrounded by them. Newman talked quite often about sentiment. We feel something must be true, therefore it is true for me. I feel it. And you said, no, look, Newman was conscious of the fact we need to actually, it's almost about, for Newman it was going back. Newman was a historian initially, you see. I mean, is going back. I want to find out his thinking process. I need to find out, in order to be able to proclaim the truth, I need to go back and know it in myself. So Newman went back, and he went back to sacred scriptures. I mean, and as a good Anglican, that was a normal thing for him to do, and that was good, for him to be doing that. And actually, that was something that he was able to bring a sort of fresh understanding of the importance of sacred scripture with him as a Catholic, and that was something that he offered us from his Anglican times. But yes, so he went back, and then of course he came across the fathers of the Church, the people that were near to the apostolic times, that were nearest, had contact with the apostolic times, and he was blown away. Spiritually, I think, really. He was moved hugely by what he found. And that process was something that he became deeply steeped in, what the fathers of the Church had. And so that it was here that he said, we find the truth. And then we go on. And then what we need to do is to say, okay, so that was the process, the going back was the process which which took him and led him eventually, led him into the church, led him into the Catholic Church.
Yeah, because I think it's just worth stopping there and just thinking about one thing which really comes across with Newman is that he had this he would search for the truth without kind of preconceptions and then kind of follow it kind of all the way.
Yes.
Consequences be damned in a sense.
Yes.
And he paid for he paid a very high personal price for following that truth, didn't he?
He did. I mean, he was limpet-like in his clinging to the truth. But then it was a question. You see, I think for him, it was what I think he must have found incredibly incredibly upsetting. I mean, he was somebody that was the most mannered is the wrong word. He was a very approachable person, hugely approachable, loved. As a tutor at Oxford, he was adored by all of his students. He was loved. And his motto, his cardinal motto is cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaks to heart. He was somebody that loved. I think he found it incredibly upsetting that people took offence. And so I think he
what took offence at what he
had
done in converting,
if you like, challenge. Well, converting. Yes, certainly that was immense. I mean, he was as a convert. This was at a time when Catholics in this country were considered. Well, I mean, they were sort of impossible. I don't want to put
poor ignorant immigrants,
exactly.
Basically.
We're talking that sort of thing. We're talking about, so certainly somebody of the genius of Newman becoming a convert was immense in itself, hugely controversial. No, but what I meant was that within the church he was controversial. I mean, in the sense that he was somebody that would say that as he saw the truth as he saw it, but then he found what he needed to do was to try and unpack that truth. And he spent most of his life, in a sense, being defensive, just saying, having to explain. He was the great explainer. I need to explain what I mean. And this also led him to understand about doctrine, the development of doctrine, that teaching needs to speak to the world in which we live. And Newman would recast and try and find ways of saying what needed to be said, not trying to change what needed to be said, but to let it develop. This is the idea of the development of doctrine is something that I think is important to understand. Somebody once said, I think it was rather a good point, that Newman, there was a distinction between evolution and development. When we talk about evolution, we mean, we evolved from a tadpole. I know nothing about biology, but we evolved.
From one very different thing into another, basically.
From one very different thing into another. Whereas development is the growing up, the maturation, the person that becomes a bigger, richer, fuller person as they grow older, so to speak, with us. And that it's in that sense that Newman saw development, the meaning of development. Doctrine, the germ of everything is there. And when you go back, the germ of everything is there. It needs to be explained. I mean, St. Paul, in Paul's understanding, that we are the earthenware vessels. Our responsibility is to present the treasures. And Newman took this. That was, if you like, a leitmotif in the way that he was working.
So less tadpole to human than acorn to oak, essentially.
Exactly. Yeah. There we go. That's nice. Nice way of putting it. Yeah.
I mean, I often think that Newman has been sort of traduced through. Or was in his own lifetime, and in a sense has kind of continued to be. In that often people will just take the title of one of his essays, say on the development of doctrine, and then just say, well, Newman said the development of doctrine, therefore we can just develop it however we want, kind of thing. Which I think Newman would have been like absolutely horrified.
Oh, horrified.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, within the church, people saying, doctrine, what is he doing? Doctrine is frozen. There was a sense of fear. And I think that was particularly true, that sort of reactive, very defensive. Remember, the church was under enormous pressure, and secular pressure at that time in Italy, so there was an enormous sense of defensiveness. So there was that fear that we must not let go of what we hold to be fast. And Newman would have been first in line to say that. But on the other hand, we've got to present what we believe in a way that's going to engage people and resonate in the world in which we live. And that's the challenge, that's the task, that's what we've got to do, to find ways of letting the truth resonate in the world in which we live. And so in all the different ways he worked on that. Yes, but you're right. It's a temptation to slide off and use the word liberal, or use understand liberalism in our modern sense of the word, or development of doctrine, or if you
or
like,
conscience even,
or the conscience. Exactly. My conscience says. But Newman was interesting on conscience. I mean, he said conscience for him was a really important strand, and a central strand in the development of our faith, and that. Newman talked about arriving at faith in I think a rather powerful way, in what he called a book called The Grammar of Assent. He talked about the distinction that's made between an iron rod and a cable. An iron rod is a singular thing, and if you build everything around that singular thing and you put it under too much pressure, it might break, and it would break. Eventually it will. However strong it seems, in the slings and arrows of things, if that's faith with that, well, then that's what you rely on. Then it's liable to be possibly broken. I mean, that was nothing wrong in the fact that you're building something singular. But Newman wanted to say, look, listen, a cable is made up of lots of different strands, in themselves feeble, but they come together, they wind together, and they make something incredibly strong and malleable and able to move with the time. And one of those central strands, around which everything would have gone, would have been the conscience for Newman, was to say, God speaks to us in the conscience. Little children, I mean, as a school chaplain, I know this, we all know this. We've all said, it's not fair. The first things children say, aren't they? It's not fair. What's that if it's not a demonstration of the fact that there's something in us that says there is something that's justice is out there, and in one way that either I'm being unjust, and that's my conscience telling me that, or those people over there are being unjust, and I want to awaken in them their conscience in realizing that they're doing something. So conscience for Newman was something that's God-given, and it's God's voice there. But we have to be careful with the voice of conscience, because it can become twisted. We can stamp on our conscience. I mean, Pope Benedict was very struck by this as growing up with Nazism in Germany in the build-up, and he quoted this chilling when he was talking about Newman. He said, and coming across Newman, this chilling sentence from a Nazi: "I have no conscience. My conscience is Hitler." And this was profoundly. It said it all for Pope Benedict. And this was the sort of thing that he saw, and people became hugely interested in Newman on the conscience, because they could say, look, listen, it's so important that we ground our conscience in what it should be grounded in, the truth. And so it comes back to the truth again. You see, in veritatem, it all comes back to the truth, really, I think, in that way.
And once Newman had sort of discovered the truth, he'd kind of gone, he'd gone deep into history, into scripture, into the fathers. Then his life's work became, in a sense, kind of defending the truth, explaining the truth. Yeah. I mean, in our own small part of the CTS, I think we took a lot of inspiration in our foundation, and also we published some of Newman's works early in our history. What we've continued to do ever since, was that moment in which he said that he wanted a laity in particular that was able, that knew their faith,
yes,
and was able to defend it in that moment in which Catholicism had become kind of legal again in Britain, and he was very much part of that process. Absolutely. I mean, it was sort. This comes back to education. You see again, how did the laity need educating? It's not about. We all need educating. We all need the truth unpacked for us. We all need. We need to. I say unpacked for us. We need to respond. We need to have this present. We need to be awakened to the truth in one way. Yeah, that it's not enough sort of pay, pray, and obey.
Exactly. It's not. That's a nice way of putting it. Pay, pray, and obey. That was exactly what Newman was saying, and that had been, and partly out of, as I was explaining, the defensiveness that existed in the church in those days, in our church. But it wasn't just in our church. This was the same threat was being experienced in the Church of England as well, in one way or another. And so it was saying, look, listen, the laity. I tell you what, the way to think of this, I think, and that is. The motto that John Henry Newman, I mentioned earlier, that used for his cardinal motto, cor ad cor loquit, heart speaks to heart. Well, now, on the face of it, yes, this is, if you like, you could understand that as being God speaking to me heart to heart. But Newman also understood that it's more than that. It is that, but it's more than that. It's also, I've got to lean out and let my heart be touched by other people. And Newman was big on that. He as a tutor at university at Oxford from a young age. I mean, even before that, and as a pastor,
I think he was one of the youngest.
He was quite, again, very controversial, because he was trying to resurrect an understanding that teachers need to move the hearts and the ethical. I mean, it's coming back to the giving moral help. But for Newman, it was hugely important to learn from other people, because they're made in God's image just as he was. So Newman was looking always out to be influenced. He was somebody that influenced vast numbers of people, but he would have been the first to say, I have been influenced by vast numbers of people. And he'd been influenced because he was looking for Christ speaking through them to him, to let their heart speak to his heart. And that was something that was what he wore. He wore his heart on his sleeve. And that was very controversial at that time.
I suppose we should also maybe say something about the grammar of assent. I mean, I'm wondering whether we've covered, the main texts.
I mean, how to cover. This is a book that was written, that was written to try again, and again we're talking about truth. I mean, in a sense we have, in the sense, I mean, it's a very, very profound and it's not an easy read, but nevertheless it's worth reading. I mean, Newman reads well. I think Newman reads incredibly well. One always approaches it with slight trepidation, because he's dealing with the philosophical question about how we come across God, and the fundamental, almost philosophical questions around the existence of God. But I really, in a sense, talked about in talking about the cable and the iron rod. I mean, the difference between when assent becomes real. If it's up in our heads, it's notional. If it's all intellectual, it's notional. But if you've listened to the Dream of Gerontius, or you've been moved by art, or you've been moved by people, and especially if you've been moved by people, then all of these strands come together, and your assent to the existence to faith, your faith assent, and that's really the assent, is, if you like, it's a book that describes how do we think about making an agreement to God, accepting faith. It's about faith, how faith develops. And what he's trying to say is, look, listen, it's much richer than simply an exercise in cold logic that's going to arrive at a rather pallid understanding of what the faith is, which is going to be very, very easily fractured if it's not supported. But it's much more than that, so that our hearts can be engaged. Coming back to heart again, heart speaking to heart. The faith needs to travel. I mean, there's nothing novel in that. But it's the way that Newman spoke about it at the time in which he did, and at the time in which he speaks to it now. And the way, the words, the expressions, the quotations, that's where it's worth looking and reading into and seeing and understanding with John Henry Newman, because he can put this so beautifully and lucidly in all the different ways that he does. Yeah.
I mean, we're speaking just a few months after the election of the first English-speaking pope. And I'm still kind of shocked sometimes to hear, the Pope speaking fluently in English, giving, summaries of his Wednesday audiences in my own mother tongue. It's a very, very odd experience. This is the first doctor of the church who wrote in English as well. Yeah. I mean, is there? I mean, I wouldn't say there's like a sort of significance necessarily to that, but I mean, as English-speaking Catholics, for example, I mean, maybe we can come back to what it means for the English in particular. But the fact that he wrote that he's the first one who wrote in English is quite something, isn't it?
It is, and that he wrote so beautifully in English. I mean, he was a great. I mean, Newman was fated when he was at Oxford for the beauty of his English, of his sermons, which he wrote out word by word. I mean, it wasn't extempore. He wrote every single word out. And particularly in the Anglican days, he wrote his sermons out. Much less so as a Catholic. He would speak much more extemporary from notes in those days. But no, I mean his English was, I mean, and people would come to listen to him deliver his sermons, and it was poetic, I suppose you might. It was moving because of the way he used English.
So I think wasn't it James Joyce, I think, who pointed him out as the great, one of, I think, two great English stylists, should we say, in his language. In his language, yes. I mean, when you read him, I suppose now, we're kind of struck by, the very long sentences, for example, but also the incredible kind of precision with which he wants his thought to come across. Yes.
And the read a sentence and then stop. Because when it's a big mouthful. It's a big gobbet of material that you're taking into your head. So when you don't speed read, you can't speed read Newman.
Right.
You've got to let the words. You've got to chew them. You've got to do a bit of Lectio Divina on them, if you like. Really, you've got to chew over the words and let them to get their flavour. And I think that's to read Newman slowly is an important thing to do, which is countercultural to us, counterintuitive. I say counterintuitive to us, but it's
it's a real antidote to the kind of social media, sort of Twitter age.
Exactly.
It's very much like the opposite of a 140 character tweet.
I hadn't thought of that but I mean I think that's another reason which maybe he's something to teach us. Really, I mean just in the way that we take on material, take on ideas. To what extent we need to rediscover that. Well, that's another way in which we can think of his teaching as being timeless. It's an important point, I think, actually.
So if someone wanted to read Newman, where should they start?
Oh, golly, I was hoping you weren't going to ask that question. I think you need to go in. There's a very good website, I should say, which is called the National Institute of Newman Studies have produced, where they've digitized everything that Newman has written. So you don't have to wade through all volumes of letters and diaries in order to find quotation to go into an area that you're interested in. I would say that of all the books that Newman wrote, that I personally find most useful is the idea. Well, the first book I first came across was The Idea of University, and I read that as a student, and I skim-read bits of it because that was the way I was reading in those days, and still do, of course. But I was looking and was struck by bits and pieces of it there, and I think it reads well. It's really a series of lectures that are put together that Newman presented to all the people that were starting the new Catholic university, and describes to them, listen, this is what's unique and distinctive, what needs to be unique and distinctive about education at university, but more than that, really, about educating people. And that was really what Newman... So it's episodic in the sense that there are lots of different... each lecture is added on one to another, but it's I think, an excellent book to read.
You minister in a very famous church, the Brompton Oratory, famous for, well, it's in an amazing place in London. Yeah. It's got an incredible history. It's produces some of the most amazing music and liturgy. And I mean, what's your favourite thing about being at the Brompton Oratory?
I think the music. You see, I think the church is beautiful. The church is it's a statement church. It's saying the Catholic Church has come back to England, and it's very beautiful, and it's full of candles, full of prayer. But especially, I think, when it's full of music. It's a church I think it's music that makes that we're justifiably well known for. We have 3 different choirs: little children's choir, brilliant, and then we've got a phenomenally good choir. Our school choir is world famous. It's absolutely super. It sang at the canonization. Sadly, they weren't able to come join us for the Doctor of the Church, but they're unbelievable. And then we have a wonderful top professional choir. So music, I would say, is the kind of character of the church when you go in there at a service. I think, yeah.
So I think I said that we'd come back to this. So maybe in conclusion, I mean, what does this mean for the church in England? And in a sense, what were the qualities of Englishness, should we say, that Newman kind of models for the whole the whole world and the whole church. We say, if at all. I mean, because he definitely was a sort of product of very much a product of some really very specifically English things.
Yes.
The Anglican Church, Oxford, and yet he seems to have taken these up and really sort of brought them to something, beautiful. I think.
Yes. I think it's as we're speaking. I'm speaking as an Englishman, and you're speaking, Piero, although
certainly an adopted Englishman.
An adopted Englishman. It's sometimes difficult to look at us from the outside, but I think the idea of a sort of English gentleman idea, which people would, in a sense, Newman, what does that mean? And I think Newman sort of describes very well what it should be about, which is all about being attentive to other people, listening, coming, and in the best sense, when we're at our best, we're understanding and becoming tolerant and more than tolerant, looking out for the feelings of other people, going to where they are. Newman once described charity as a feature of charity ought to be that we go into the feelings, that we enter into the mind and feelings of other people. And in a sense, I think that's a feature that when we are at our best, we're sensitive to the feelings of other people, and we tolerate. I suppose that's what we mean by being a tolerant society, and that we think of ourselves. It's difficult for us to say, and I'm sure that's arguable. But and whether we're particularly unique in that, I don't know. But that's something that is held up as that sort of the English gentleman, the idea. Newman would personify that.
Mm. So you've seen Newman go from blessed saint to doctor of the church. I mean, is there anywhere else to go for him? Not really. No. So how do you reflect on that journey and your own part in it?
Being carried along, I tell you, I think the sense of divine providence, actually, really the sense of divine providence. When the miracle was first, for the canonization, that was when I first got actively involved, really, to help out. To help out in the process of trying to pull things together for the canonization, and for the events which we celebrated in Rome in 2019, and then meeting the Miraculae, Melissa Villalobos, in the United States, and hearing her story, and so and then how everything in the process of developing in the plans and everything seemed to slot into place. The sense of divine providence, I would have said, has been really quite extraordinary, and it often would surprise me. Things which would seem insurmountably difficult would disappear, and not least actually the doctor of the church thing. Initially, there was quite a kind of, the first reaction was, well, I mean, and I got there, whether it was me being sensitive to this, but I slightly got the impression, well, I mean, we haven't had an Anglo-Saxon. We don't know about in these Anglo-Saxons being doctor of the church. There was a slight sort of sense. I slightly got that slightly sort of, I'm not sure about that, when I first made approaches to the dicastery. But divine providence. I mean, God's at work. Yeah.
I mean, I get the feeling that Newman's become like a real friend to you over the years. And he himself set a lot of store by the importance of friendship. Yeah. And I mean, I'd be interested just to know.
Well, I'll tell you an interesting thing. Yeah, I mean, my great grandfather was a student at Oxford, and used to hang around. He was Church of Ireland. He wasn't Catholic. He was the Church of Ireland, and he was desperate. He wrote beautifully in his own way, about the immense effect that Newman had on him. Mm. And I mean, and he very nearly became a Catholic. But didn't actually. But very nearly became a Catholic, and was on his journey. He wrote rather movingly about being on a journey up to Birmingham to go and offer himself and to say, look, listen to Newman. He was a very quiet and shy man, but had come across Newman and had been blown away by this man and his gentleness and his holiness, really. And so, in a strange kind of a way, my great grandfather, I feel there's a sense in which I'm finishing off a journey that began with my great-grandfather.
Well, that's lovely. And I suppose, in a sense, what the church is offering us is Newman as a teacher to everybody in the church. So, I think is what would you say that really you would hope that this announcement would cause within the church with regard to Newman.
Cause within the church, and also get people to look and get people to think about truth and objective truth. Get to think about, listen, I've got to listen to my voice of conscience. Get people to think about, that I think especially is to see, look, listen, the world in which we live, we need to try and find the objective truth, the truth that we can only find as people of faith in the Lord that gave us life and sees us as journeying towards him, and that is our life. And in a sense, that's what our life ought to be about. I am the way, the truth, and the life, says the Lord. And so, in a sense, but Newman can help us rediscover that and focus on the importance of finding the truth that is in Christ, finding freedom in the truth. As I said to you before, finding freedom in the truth rather than freedom from the truth. I think fundamentally that's going to be the thing, I would have said, the most important thing that Newman can teach us in one way or another.
Yeah. Which
is
as important now as in any age, but kind of seems especially important.
Yes, or timelessly important. But Newman is one that can bring it to life to us and articulate it in our language very well. So look out for quotes on that.
Many thanks for speaking to us about this.
It's been my pleasure.
Thank you. CTS is producing a few publications to honour this moment. For Father Herman Geisler's book on Newman, a new doctor of the church, and also we have a couple of monographs coming out in the scholarly press on a couple of addresses about Our Lady, and also his second spring sermon, which is particularly important in there's an anniversary of it this year. So wonderful. Thank you so much for speaking to us.
My pleasure.